Dr. Atul Gawande, who helped push this whole revolution into medicine. His maxim kind of defines the rule for all successful lists, and it's this. The checklist must be short, extremely simple, and carefully tested in the real world.
Okay, so that's key. Can't be some massive binder you pull off a shelf.
Absolutely not. If your list takes too long, if it's too wordy, or if it was designed in an office that's miles away from the actual surgical table or the trading floor,
Nobody's going to use it.
it simply will not be used when you need it most. We are looking for lists that are tools for safety and communication, not, compliance for compliance's sake.
So let's start where the stakes are most visceral then, inside the surgical theater. Because from what I've read, this is where the most profound evidence for this checklist revolution really came from.
It is. It's where they proved you could transform silent, deadly assumptions into explicit, life-saving confirmations.
We're beginning then with a checklist as a kind of mandatory team ritual.
Yes, a critical communication device. It's designed specifically to prevent shared mistakes in these fast-moving, high-consequence environments.
And where are we starting this story?
We start in a place that's pretty far removed from a high-tech, first-world surgical theater, and that's critical to understanding the universal power of this. The setting is Ifakara, Tanzania, in 2008.
Okay.
This was one of the initial pilot sites for the World Health Organization's, the WHO's global effort called Safe Surgery Saves Lives.
When you look at an operating room, especially one in a setting with limited resources, you have to imagine there's an incredible amount of professional focus.
Immense.
Everyone on that team is dedicated, they're competent, highly trained. The immediate assumption is that this level of professionalism, it should be enough, right? It should be enough to ensure safety.
And that was the awkward, kind of brutal truth that the WHO study uncovered. That professionalism, while absolutely necessary, is not sufficient.
It's not enough on its own.
No. In a complex surgical process with dozens of steps, multiple handoffs, inherent stress, it's not the rare, complicated steps that fail. It's the incredibly basic ones.
Like what?
Forgetting to confirm the patient's identity, skipping a necessary antibiotic dose, missing a critical instrument count at the end of the procedure, things that everyone assumes the person next to them handled.
That I thought you did a moment.
That's the one.
That's the ultimate failure point. It's where that silent assumption replaces confirmation.
And the list steps in as the required cultural interruption. The intervention itself was deceptively simple. They introduced a deliberate 19-item surgical safety checklist.
19 items. That's it.
That's it. And it wasn't designed to replace the surgeon's memory. It was designed as a mandatory pause button tied to 3 critical transition points in the procedure.
Okay, what were those 3 points and why were they chosen? I'm guessing they're the moments with the most complex handoffs.
You're exactly right. They tied the checklist to the beginning, the middle, and the end of the whole process. First, you have the sign-in. This happens before anesthesia is even administered.
Very first step.
Right. It's the moment to confirm the patient's identity, the site of the operation, or the consent form's complete. Basic, but vital.
Okay.
Second, you have the timeout, which happens immediately before the first incision. This is where the whole team verbally confirms things like, is antibiotic prophylaxis given? Or are there any anticipated critical events?
Everyone stops for a second.
Everyone stops. And third, the sign-out. This is performed before the patient leaves the operating room. It ensures instrument counts are correct and that any specimens are properly labeled. These are the transitions where ownership shifts and communication is just most likely to break down.
But the sources noted there was immediate resistance. I can just picture it. You're asking these highly autonomous, highly trained surgeons to stop their work and literally read a script in front of their team.
It completely flies in the face of the self-image of the master artisan.
Exactly.
And it absolutely did. Gawande documented that initial friction, and he noted that the resistance was cultural. Surgeons worried it would disrupt the flow.
Make them look less competent.
Or just waste time when time is so precious. The core objection was, I am a professional, I don't need a recipe.
Right.
The whole system of expertise is built on trust in individual competence, and the checklist, at first glance, it seems to erode that very trust.
This is the crucial point for anyone listening then. How do you introduce a mandatory ritual into a culture of expertise without causing a full-on rebellion?
You focus on the results, and the results here were the true hinge moment that just silenced the critics. The WHO pilot study wasn't small. It analyzed 7,688 patients across 8 highly diverse pilot sites.
So not just in Tanzania.
No, everywhere,
Yeah.
including wealthy cities like Seattle and London and developing world settings like New Delhi and Manila. They were testing this concept in every possible scenario.
And the data wasn't marginal, was it? It was devastatingly clear.
It was a complete game changer. Across all of those sites, the rate of major complications fell from 11% down to 7%.
That's huge.
When you are dealing with thousands of procedures, reducing major complications by a third is an extraordinary result. And even more profound, inpatient deaths fell significantly, from 1.5% down to 0.8%.
Wow. That's a near halving of mortality risk, just from a 19-item list.
A near halving just by introducing a simple, verbally confirmed list.
A reduction in mortality of that magnitude, purely from structured communication. It proves that the biggest risk wasn't a lack of technical skill with the scalpel.
No.
It was the predictable human failure of communication and memory under pressure.
The checklist didn't teach anyone new surgical techniques, it just enforced discipline. It forced everyone to stop, look, and confirm aloud the steps they were most likely to skip when they were rushed.
It turns silent assumptions like, surely someone gave the antibiotic, into loud, explicit, shared confirmations.
Exactly. The nurse had to say, antibiotic prophylaxis given, and the other nurse says, yes, 7:43 a.m.
Yeah.
Once surgeons saw that data, the real measurable reduction in deaths and complications, the cultural resistance just evaporated.
Because it wasn't an insult to their mastery anymore.
It was a tool that protected their mastery from human fallibility.
So the principle we extract here is really profound. The most powerful checklists are team rituals. They're tied to transition points, and they're designed to force shared external confirmation over our own internal assumptions.
So for you listening, find the equivalent of your sign-in, timeout, sign-out moments in your next big project or process.
And you have to remember that Gowon rule. Keep it simple.
Absolutely. If the checklist is too long, the team will just cut corners or skip it entirely when things get stressful. The list has to be light enough to be consistent, but critical enough to save you. And sound is key, make it spoken. The act of hearing the confirmation enforces accountability in a way that just signing a form never will.
That focus on communication under stress is a perfect bridge to our next section. We're going from the operating room up to 30,000 feet to see how timing and sequence are just as crucial as content.
Right. If surgery shows us how to communicate, aviation shows us how to maintain control when the system is actively trying to melt down.
Our next anecdote is, it's truly a masterclass in crisis management. We're talking about Qantas flight QF32. It's an Airbus A380 leaving Singapore on November 4th, 2010. It's headed for Sydney with 469 people on board.
And just 4 minutes after takeoff, the engine catastrophically fails.
And this wasn't a minor failure.
Oh, no. This wasn't a contained engine failure. This was an uncontained failure. Engine number 2 disintegrated. It threw shrapnel that punctured the wing, ruptured fuel lines, damaged the landing gear. It took out dozens of control systems.
So Captain Richard Champion de Crespigny and his crew, they immediately faced a situation that was far beyond anything in the standard procedure manuals.
Far beyond. This event didn't just cause a mechanical crisis, it triggered an information crisis, a cognitive storm.
A cognitive storm, I like that. So modern aircraft rely heavily on these automated systems, right? They're designed to guide the crew through procedures.
But in a cascading failure like this, those systems can actually become the enemy.
How so?
Well, the system is the ECAM, the Electronic Centralized Aircraft Monitoring System. It's designed to prioritize and display failure information and the corresponding procedures. Under normal circumstances, it's a brilliant aid.
But these weren't normal circumstances.
Not at all.
Yeah.
When QF-32's engine exploded, the plane immediately lost several hydraulic systems, electrical systems, computer systems. The ECAM didn't just register one failure, it registered 100 failures simultaneously.
100. And what was the result of that sensory overload?
The system started queuing checklists. The sources detail that 40 checklists queued up immediately, followed quickly by another 60, bringing the total to nearly 100 queued procedures, all demanding attention.
And I assume it's not quiet in the cockpit at this point.
Not at all. On top of all that, you have continuous, jarring, distracting alarms sounding, which de Crespigny noted were designed specifically to pierce our senses.
This is a perfect example of how a safety tool, the checklist, can become a psychological threat if it's not managed properly.
Yeah.
If they had just plunged straight into reading 100 queued procedures, what would have happened?
They would have lost sight of the fundamental task, flying the plane.
Right.
They would have been buried in procedure while the aircraft's stability degraded. So the crew faced two crises at the same time, a mechanical disaster and an information avalanche. And the real lesson here isn't just how they used the checklist, but the discipline they had to sequence its use.
They didn't start with the procedures. They
Right.
started with the primal core of their training control.
Absolutely. De Crespigny held fast to the universal pilot mantra: aviate, navigate, communicate. The first move wasn't reading the screen, it was stabilizing the machine.
He pressed altitude hold.
He pressed altitude hold, ensuring the aircraft wasn't moving closer to the ground or accelerating uncontrollably. He explicitly stated that there was no rush to go into ECAM. He knew they had to buy time to think. And they bought that time by stabilizing the aircraft first.
That discipline, the creation of time to think when every signal is screaming for immediate action, that's the hinge moment for any crisis manager. It's so counterintuitive.
It is.
We are trained to react instantly to a loud noise or a flashing light, but here, the delay was the safety measure.
The delay was the system working as intended. Only once stability was achieved, once the aircraft was safely holding a flight path, only then did de Crespigny give the cue: ECAM actions.
And what did that mean?
That was the formal delegation of the procedure execution to the rest of the highly experienced cockpit crew, while he, as the captain, maintained the flying duties. This sequence stabilized, then checklist, was what allowed them to triage 100 procedures over several hours and bring that heavily damaged plane in safely.
This translates directly to any listener's crisis moments. When your system crashes or your project is on fire or a client escalates, the initial urge is to panic checklist,
Yeah.
to just dive into the immediate fixes.
Mm-hmm.
But the lesson from QF32 is to pause, press the equivalent of altitude hold, stabilize your situation, and then look at the list.
And that stability extends to team dynamics, too.
Yeah.
The sources really emphasize the need for psychological safety in this context. The checklist and the procedures, they only work if everyone is empowered to interrupt.
What do you mean?
If a junior crew member sees a step missed or a procedure executed incorrectly, they have to feel safe enough to use the standardized interruption language. Stop, verify, step X. The QF32 crew exemplified this. They operated in an environment of total transparency and shared accountability.
So if we are to adopt this, what are the key tactics we should steal? It sounds like we need structured role assignment and a clear, stabilized protocol.
That's it. First, adopt the two-phase rule. Stabilize checklist. Before you open the action item list, make sure the environment is stable enough for deliberate thought.
And second,
Second, adopt clear, non-negotiable roles. You need a pilot, someone who maintains stability and keeps an eye on the bigger picture, the altitude, the timeline. You need a reader who methodically works through the procedure. And maybe most importantly, in complex crises, you need a spotter. Yeah, whose only job is to watch for secondary risks and confirm the reader's actions. You cannot improvise these roles when you're under stress.
the genius of the checklist here is not the list itself, but the framework it provides for coordinating specialized effort under extreme duress.
You're outsourcing memory and execution to the list.
Exactly. And that allows the highest skilled person, the pilot, to focus on the highest stakes task, which is flying the unstable machine.
The list becomes the communication medium. It dictates the rhythm, and the team's training dictates the timing. Without the discipline to sequence that timing, the list itself would have been a factor in the disaster.
The checklist doesn't save you.
Your discipline and your teamwork save you. The checklist is just the tool that makes that possible.
Okay, so moving from team communication and external crisis management, we now pivot to the individual decision maker. This is fascinating. This section explores how a checklist prevents self-deception by archiving past errors and neutralizing the most expensive biases, fear and greed.
This is where the list stops being a safety net against, just forgetting something. And it starts becoming a cognitive guardrail against faulty judgment. We're looking at high-stakes environments where the complexity isn't mechanical, but financial and psychological.
Our setting shifts to Irvine, California in 2008. The financial crisis has just hit, and value investor Monish Pabray, who manages Pabray Investment Funds, is facing a truly brutal reality.
It was bad. His funds were down 60%, while the broader market was down roughly 38%.
Ouch.
That level of underperformance is devastating, and it requires some serious introspection.
Right. When the market falls 38%, that's systemic risk. Everyone's losing money. But when you lose 60%,
That implies you have made substantial, idiosyncratic, and probably avoidable mistakes in your specific holdings, and Pabray admitted that. The losses weren't just market turbulence. Some of the mistakes were visible when the tide went out, meaning he had overlooked warning signs during the investment process itself.
Faced with this failure, he didn't just lick his wounds or blame the market. He pivoted entirely, asking a core question. If this were a plane crash, what would the investigators do?
It's such a great framing. He modeled his recovery process on the FAA's response to an aircraft disaster. The FAA doesn't treat a crash as a freak accident,
No, they see it as a data point.
a critical data point. They conduct an exhaustive, ruthless investigation to determine the root cause, and then they implement systemic changes to ensure that specific failure mode never happens again.
His definition of a financial plane crash was the permanent loss of capital.
Which is a brilliant definition. It focuses on the irreversible errors, not just the temporary volatility that scares everyone.
So that definition created the raw material for his new system.
It did. He started by dissecting his own worst investments, asking, what was the single root cause I ignored? Then he studied the major mistakes made by legendary investors, Warren Buffett's misstep with Dexter Shoe, or the various pitfalls related to capital-intensive businesses.
And what did he find?
The consistent finding was that the fatal flaws were usually simple, they were visible, and they were predictable. They were ignored because of optimism or just being in a rush.
Here is where the checklist design becomes revolutionary. He didn't create a list of general investment advice like buy low, sell high.
No, that's useless.
Yeah.
He converted every single past failure into a specific, forward-looking, disconfirming question.
Did you give us an example of that?
Yeah, of course. So let's say an investor gets really excited about a management team that is aggressive but leveraged. The general advice is, be careful with debt.
Which, as you say, is useless.
It's totally useless. But Bry would transform that into a disconfirming question like, does the current leverage ratio exceed the maximum historical ratio during a trough business cycle? If the answer is yes, you stop, you don't proceed.
It's a binary gate.
It is. The classic example is the one you mentioned earlier. Buffett's mistake with Dexter Shoe. It was destroyed by foreign competition and globalization. Bry translated that scar into the specific question. Can this business be harmed by foreign competition, low-cost labor?
Ah, I see. That question doesn't ask if the business is great. It asks if a fundamental, fatal vulnerability exists.
That is the power of the archive of scars. It forces the decision-maker in the heat of a new, exciting deal to pass their future optimism through the gate of their own past reality.
So how long did this list get?
The resulting list grew to about 97 to 98 questions, and it was sorted into categories like moat, management, and valuation. But the brilliance is that it only takes him 15 to 20 minutes to run through the entire list.
Why is that time commitment so critical? If it takes 15 to 20 minutes to protect millions of dollars, why does the time even matter?
Because consistency is paramount. If the checklist takes an hour, you will skip it when the deal deadline is tight or when you feel overconfident.
Right.
The time box ensures the checklist is a simple, required ritual before you commit capital. It prevents the selective memory that says, oh, this time it's different, or I don't need to check that one because I just feel really good about the CEO.
The principle, then, is that the checklist serves as a portable archive of scars. If you're building anything, a business, a new product, a portfolio, your list should not be a list of tasks you intend to do. It should be a list of the costly mistakes you refuse to repeat.
And we can leverage this immediately. Listeners should start what we could call a failure to question log. Document every significant mistake in business, in a relationship, in a fitness goal. Determine the single root cause. And then translate that cause into the simplest, most powerful, disconfirming question that would have stopped you if you had only asked it beforehand. Sort these questions into clear categories so when you are under pressure, you are running a systematic diagnostic, not just relying on selective memory.
That concept, turning painful past reality into a future cognitive defense, is the perfect setup for discussing the raw emotion that so often drives us to ignore those questions in the first place. Let's look at the psychological side of high-stakes decision-making, focusing on another value investor, Guy Spire, who spoke openly about using checklists not just for company analysis, but for emotional regulation right after the 2008 crisis.
Spire's analysis is really rooted in neuroscience. He argues that the market environment is specifically designed to trigger ancient parts of the human brain.
The lizard brain.
The lizard brain, exactly. When assets are plummeting, we trigger the threat detection fear mechanism, the primal fight-or-flight response. When an asset is skyrocketing, we trigger what he called irrational exuberance, the pleasure or greed mechanism.
And as soon as either of those emotional systems is active, our capacity for rational thought is severely compromised. Our nervous system just becomes louder than the spreadsheet.
It creates tunnel vision. Fear makes us overcertain that catastrophe is imminent, driving us to sell at the absolute bottom. Greed makes us overcertain that the boom will last forever, driving us to buy at the very top.
So true.
And Speer points out that only a rare few individuals, like a Warren Buffett, seem naturally equipped to remain rational and detached amid all that market chaos. For the rest of us, the 99.9%, we need a tool that's designed to interrupt that emotional autopilot.
And the checklist is that handrail.
It's the handrail, designed to pull the user back to what he called the happy middle.
But I'm sure most investors use spreadsheets and complicated models. How is a simple checklist different from a standard due diligence process?
It's different because the checklist specifically targets the user's internal state, not just the investment's external facts. Speer argues that portfolios often reflect the biases of the investor, their blind spots, their desires, their need for validation, far more than they reflect pure market facts.
So the checklist has to serve as a mirror for self-deception.
Exactly. That is where it gets truly introspective. It forces the investor to confront their own internal dialogue.
What kind of questions did Speer build into his list to check his own biases?
Well, the questions were designed to expose ego and emotional drivers. For instance, he had questions related to management meetings. Did I talk to management in their office?
Why does that matter?
Speer noted that meeting management in their fancy office, surrounded by symbols of wealth, it triggers subconscious greed and a desire to be part of the club. His rule was often to conduct due diligence outside of that high-pressure environment.
That's fascinating.
Another crucial set of questions focused on confirmation bias.
So asking not just, do the facts support this investment, but something more like, what facts am I ignoring because they contradict what I want to be true?
Precisely. Speer's most quoted point on this was, the real question is, why am I discarding them the inconvenient facts, and what personal biases am I engaging in as I discard them? The checklist becomes an emotional regulation tool that forces that moment of self-audit. It's an interruption system. When you are rushing to buy, the list forces a deliberate, standardized pause.
That concept, installing an interruption point against internal emotional surges, that applies to so many high-stakes decisions outside of finance.
Oh, absolutely.
Making a spontaneous major purchase, getting involved in a conflict you know you shouldn't, or hiring someone based purely on charm and not on their references.
All of it. We can steal two essential tactics from Speer's system. First, the state check. Put it at the absolute top of your list.
State check.
Before you even start analyzing the facts, you have to name your current emotion. Fear, greed, pride, fatigue, excitement. If you can't name the emotion, it is likely driving the decision. Just acknowledging the bias is the first step toward neutralizing it.
And the second tactic, the cooling off rule, seems equally necessary for anything driven by breaking news or sudden, exciting opportunities.
Yes. If the decision is triggered by a sudden spike in news, a major competitor's failure, a stock market surge, or an unexpected promotion, you have to impose a fixed waiting period, maybe 24 or 48 hours before you execute the decision. It allows the acute emotional surge to subside. The rational self then returns to answer the checklist questions, ensuring the decision is vetted by the happy middle version of you, not the reactive fear or greed version.
The lesson is clear. If you are serious about minimizing expensive mistakes driven by internal bias, you have to structure an intervention point that forces introspection. The checklist is not just a handrail for your work, it's a handrail for your mind.
Grab it before you lean too far.
We've established how checklists save lives through communication and prevent self-destruction through cognitive regulation. Now we tackle the final and I think broadest domain, how checklists scale excellence. This is about moving from preventing individual mistakes to ensuring reliable, repeatable outcomes at massive scale.
This is the checklist as a knowledge transfer mechanism. It's how you take the best performance, distill it into a system, and make that performance reproducible across thousands of locations or millions of users. It makes quality inevitable rather than optional.
And our journey starts in San Bernardino, California in 1954 with Ray Kroc. He was supposed to be selling milkshake mixers,
That's right. Instead, he stumbled upon the McDonald Brothers hamburger stand, which was running 8 of his multi-mixers at the same time.
8 of them.
Kroc didn't just see volume, he saw a revolution in process efficiency. The McDonald brothers had radically redesigned their entire operation back in 1948. They called it the Speedy Service System.
And what did that system involve?
They eliminated nearly all customization. They cut the menu down to the basics, burgers, fries, shakes, and they reorganized the kitchen like an assembly line. This wasn't a restaurant relying on a brilliant chef. It was an efficient factory relying on a brilliant system.
The genius was that the burgers weren't just fast. They were predictably fast and predictably good. Every single element of the kitchen was engineered for consistency to minimize human variance.
And Kroc realized that the standard work, this checklist approach, was the core advantage. He decided to become their franchising agent, and in 1955, he opened his first McDonald's. His goal wasn't just to sell hamburgers.
No, it was to sell a promise.
Exactly. Customers had to know exactly what the McDonald's experience meant, whether they were in Des Plaines, Illinois, or downtown Chicago.
And this commitment to consistency required ruthless standardization and compliance, which is essentially the checklist at a massive institutional scale.
Kroc understood that scaling success meant tying growth directly to compliance. The source material highlights his continual emphasis on the automation and standardization of McDonald's operations. The goal wasn't just maximizing profit.
It was protecting the brand promise.
Right. Kroc famously stated, "Our aim was to ensure repeat business based on the system's reputation rather than on the quality of a single store or operator."
To protect that system, he couldn't rely on the individual talent of every teenage burger flipper. He had to embed the expertise into the process itself.
That's the key.
What are some of the most famous examples of that standardization?
They are so mundane, yet absolutely brilliant. Think of the fries. Kroc didn't just tell people to fry potatoes. He dictated the exact potato variety, the specific temperature of the oil, the precise time for cooking, the ratio of salt.
Every detail.
Every single detail was codified. The famous 10.1 patty ratio and the specific patty thickness ensured uniform cooking time. How long a burger could sit under a heat lamp, the specific way to clean the grill. These micro checklists, enforced through constant auditing, were the foundation of the empire.
And this institutionalizing of repetition, it all culminated in 1961 with the opening of Hamburger University.
That's right.
That wasn't just a place to teach management. It was a central command center for teaching the system.
Hamburger University formalized the knowledge transfer. It ensured that a great customer experience was not left up to chance or interpretation or local custom. It was specified, it was reproducible, and it was taught the exact same way globally. The list defined the minimum acceptable standard, and the training ensured that everyone met that standard.
Making the outcome inevitable.
Inevitable.
So the principle is powerful. A checklist is a scaling device. It transfers knowledge from a few expert heads into an unbreakable system, and that protects the baseline quality. The talent is then freed up to focus on real innovation, like new menu items or better supply chain management.
Instead of relitigating whether the fries are supposed to be crispy.
Exactly. So for listeners in any industry, the key tactic is to define your one McDonald's moment, that single repeatable outcome that defines excellence for your client or customer. Once you define that moment, you build your system around it.
And when you're building that system, you have to be ruthless. You need what you could call a critical 7 checklist, a list with only the steps that cause real, quantifiable damage when they are missed.
So don't burden the list with 20 minor best practices.
No. Focus on the core 7 that, if you miss them, would cause a loss of capital or a loss of reputation.
And crucially, adopt the Krupp mindset for auditing.
Yes. When a mistake happens, don't just blame the person. Audit the system. Ask, which checklist step was unclear? Did the training fail? Or is this a new failure mode that needs a new question added to the list? If you want to scale results, you have to stop relying on memory and start relying on a reproducible system.
Now let's take that concept of standardizing excellence and apply it to the most complex environment imaginable, the world of global digital infrastructure.
Okay.
Our final deep dive brings us to the high-stakes, high-complexity world of Google's Site Reliability Engineering, or SRE team. And for high stakes, let's talk about something incredibly visible. The NORAD Santa Tracker launch on Christmas Eve 2011.
When you think of a launch, you might think of a new feature. But this launch involved hosting a globally popular service that had a fixed hard deadline Christmas, Failure was catastrophic from a public relations standpoint.
I can only imagine.
The service, which usually handled a normal load, faced a traffic spike of 25 times its peak, jumping to upward of 1 million requests per second.
That's not a gentle ramp-up, that's a cliff. And the consequences are enormous. The SRA authors humorously referred to their protective features as the make children cry switches. They knew the consequences of failure were real and very, very public.
So Google, faced with this massive risk, didn't rely on the genius of its engineers alone. They installed a sophisticated system anchored by dedicated launch coordination engineers whose job was simple: manage the technical risk by running a comprehensive launch checklist.
Let's just clarify for the listener, what is SRE?
SRE stands for Site Reliability Engineering. They are the specialized teams responsible for ensuring that Google's massive distributed systems run reliably. They bridge the gap between development and operations, and they focus heavily on failure modes, monitoring, and capacity. Their entire mandate is to turn the chaos of software deployment into predictable, repeatable success.
And the checklist is their master tool.
It is. And just like Pabray's investment checklist, the discipline applied to the SRE list itself was ruthless. They enforced a rule of scars.
A rule of scars. I like that.
That is the essential difference between a functional checklist and just bureaucratic paperwork. The rule of scars meant that every single question on the SRE launch checklist had to be substantiated. It needed to be tied directly to a previous disaster, an outage, or a critical risk that had been experienced in the real world.
So no theoretical best practices.
None. New questions even required VP approval at one point, specifically to prevent checklist bloat and keep the list focused only on what actually kills a service.
The checklist is therefore a living record of lessons paid for. It's not a theory. It's a map of past failures.
And the list acted as a comprehensive map of reality that no single person could possibly hold in their head. The SRE list was segmented into critical categories that any large organization should just steal.
Like what?
For example, capacity estimates: did we actually test the system at 25x load? Monitoring and alerting: are the correct dashboards and failure alerts set up? Dependencies: what other services will fail if ours does? Security audits, and critically, rollout and rollback planning.
Why is that focus on complexity so crucial? If the engineers are the best in the world, shouldn't they remember to check capacity?
Because modern systems are so interconnected and distributed that the problem is no longer individual skill, it's the sheer volume of integration points. When you're launching a complex product, one team might handle the database, another the front end, and a third the security. The checklist forces these cross-functional teams to verify their dependencies and failure modes together.
So the left hand knows what the right hand is doing.
It guarantees that someone asks, if the database stalls, what happens to the user? It makes sure everyone is on the same page.
And the list must have authority. This leads to the gonna go moment.
Yes. The checklist review culminates in a formal meeting where the checklist has real authority. If a critical item hasn't been addressed or confirmed, someone, usually the launch coordination engineer, has the explicit protected safety to say, no go.
And that authority is crucial.
It prevents the inevitable pressure of the deadline, especially Christmas Eve, from overriding necessary discipline.
So if we're managing a high-stakes, complex launch in any field, a new product, a major marketing campaign, a system migration, what are the key tactics we should immediately implement?
First, steal those SRE categories: capacity, failure modes, monitoring, and dependencies. Build your list around those structural vulnerabilities. Second, enforce the rule of scars. Only add a question if it would have prevented a known costly failure. And third, install a powerful go-no-go moment where the person running the checklist has true authority to stop the launch.
And finally, the ultimate complexity defense, the rollback checklist.
Absolutely. Don't just ask how you launch. Ask, how do we reverse this in 10 minutes? A successful checklist for change management anticipates failure and codifies the exit strategy. If you can't quickly and predictably revert the change to a stable state, you are not ready to launch.
If you can't checklist it, you can't reliably launch it.
That is the final truth about scaling complexity.
Okay, let's unpack all of this. We started with the idea that the checklist was for amateurs, and through this deep dive, we found that it is, in fact, the essential tool for managing expertise in the face of complexity and stress.
We've seen 4 really profound functions emerge from environments that span the entire globe. First, the list is a tool for communication and safety in teams. It turns silent assumptions into explicit, life-saving confirmations, just like we saw in the WHO surgical sites.
Second, it's a device for timing and control in a crisis. It forces stabilization before execution, as Captain de Crespigny proved when he was faced with that catastrophic engine failure on QF-32. The discipline to not start the list immediately was the decisive factor.
Third, it acts as an emotional regulation and bias defense. It forces investors like PubRai and Spire to confront their own scars and their current emotional state before they commit capital. It's the ultimate defense against fear and greed.
And finally, it's the ultimate scaling device. It transfers that hard-won expertise into a predictable, reproducible system that ensures consistency, whether you are managing the perfect French fry at McDonald's or 1 million requests per second for Google's SRE team.
The universal realization here is that the greatest danger in high-stakes work isn't the complexity itself. It's the human tendency towards selective memory and silent assumption. The most dangerous mistakes are never the ones nobody knows.
No.
They're the ones everybody thinks somebody else has covered, or the crucial lessons you learned yesterday but, forgot today under pressure.
So our challenge for you listening is this. Move beyond private, unstructured to-do lists. Identify the transition points in your work, the moments where deadlines tighten or the pressure mounts, and turn that moment into a team ritual that forces external confirmation.
And if you've suffered a costly error, your next high-stakes project should be run through an archive of that past failure, converted into a pointed, disconfirming question.
Because if you are relying solely on memory, optimism, and the vague hope that this time will be fine for your next big decision,
the sources show you have not done enough. The path to breakthrough results isn't about adding some heroic genius to the mix. It's about relentlessly eliminating inevitable human error through simple, standardized discipline.
a checklist becomes a breakthrough when it turns assumptions into confirmations. We'll see you next time for another deep dive.